I've been reading from Mark's book, Catching the Limit, and there are copies of the book for sale here after the reading. It's published by Fairweather Books as part of their Northwest Poetry Series 2009. His poetry has been widely published for almost 4 decades, appearing in Carolina Quarterly, Cutbank, Pedestal Magazine, Valparaiso Poetry Review, Verse Daily, and many others. He received an MFA in creative writing from the University of Oregon. He's been a poet in the schools for the Oregon Arts Commission, an assistant poetry editor for the Northwest Review, and a board member of the Portland Poetry Festival. I'm just going to check. I'm going to say a little bit about his website. How many people have gone on his website and taken a look at his website? He has a lot of poetry on it. He's been teaching English in the public schools for 30 years. He's also the editor of poetry.us.com, an anthology publishing regional and national poets. He lives in Forest Grove with his wife, Carol. And for more information, visit his website. So would you join me in welcoming, for our May reading, our poet tonight, Mark Thalman. Mark.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor because so many people have read in this series. And when I got here tonight, I noticed there's a little sign up here, and it says, "Speakers, please place your water cups and stuff in slots below, not on the mantelpiece or the window box. We want to keep the art viewing spare space clear. Thanks." Well, my only problem is my cup is so big here, it doesn't fit any place down here. So you will see me breaking the rule. And as a teacher, I don't, like my students to break rules, but it's okay if us adults do it. I want to thank Tom for the introduction and making the arrangements for this reading. And I want to thank the Library Poetry Committee, the Letting Library, and the City of Milwaukie for sponsoring this event. As I said, it is an honor to be here. I'll be reading some new work tonight and some very old work, and a lot of in between. You're going to hear poems from Catching the Limit. You'll also hear poems from my full-length manuscripts, which are This Place Called Home, which is a sequel to Catching the Limit, and also The Peasant Dance. Well, during the summer, when I'm not teaching, I love to stay up late and write when it's very quiet. But during the school year, I write whenever I have a spare moment and enough energy. A lot of times I have a spare moment, but not the energy. Mainly I compose everything on a computer, so it allows me to write fast enough to keep up with my brain. My handwriting's pretty slow and sloppy, so I don't want to have to decipher what I just wrote. I'll write down anything on an envelope, back of an envelope, or scrap of paper if I come up with a good idea, but I've never kept a journal. I've lived half of my life in Eugene and half of it in Forest Grove and Hillsboro. I teach in Hillsboro. And next month, I'm going to finish my 30th year of teaching in the public schools. And before that, I taught for Chemeketa Community College, and I was also a poet in the schools for the Oregon Arts Commission. I'm going to start out tonight with 2 poems from my childhood, and the first one was when I was in 4th grade. It's called Show and Tell. Emily reports how her dad went deep sea fishing and hauled in a Japanese float the size of a beach ball, which bumped up against the boat. A sphere of thick green glass escaped from a fisherman's net and traveled for years, bobbing like a turtle across the Pacific. holding the exquisite globe, hands clammy as when she folk danced in the pageant. It slipped and fell, shrapnel zinging over our heads. Miraculously, no one was hit. The big metal-bellied desk shielded the front rows. Mrs. Tracy swept up shards. Everyone pointed to pieces missed. And I wished it was possible to see the released air blown inside from another continent. During the Cold War, we learned to duck and cover against bombs which never came, but it helped this day. Emily sobbing, carrying a cardboard box as though it were ashes of a loved one, left us wondering what her father would say. I would not have wanted to be her going back home for another show and tell. As a grade schooler, I was really into baseball. I collected baseball cards, and that was the era of Mickey Mantle, Roger Maris, Hank Aaron, and Willie Mays. My parents always bought season tickets to the Eugene Emeralds, so I saw a lot of games. And when the team was on the road, I would listen to KORE radio. And radio back then was a lot different than it is today. This is called Minor League Baseball, 1965. In my teenage bedroom, I tuned my transistor from Satisfaction and Love Me Do to the Eugene Emeralds. If the team was on the road, the station was too cheap to broadcast live, so the announcer would read the play-by-play off the teletype, embellishing each pitch while the continuous loop of crowd noise filled imaginary stands. Davis looks in, gets the sign, here's the pitch. When there was a hit, the sportscaster smacked wood together, simulating the crack of a bat. Perkins with a long fly to left, Crandall fading back to the warning track, the ball in my brain rocketing until it was gone. Now the thing was, the announcer was just reading the balls and strikes off the teletype. If it was a curveball or a slider or in the dirt or a fastball, he made it all up. Could never get away with that kind of stuff today. The next 4 poems are about my teaching and teaching 12 and 13-year-olds. I teach 5 classes of English every day. And grading essays used to be a difficult chore with 130 students, but this year with the overcrowding, I have 160 students. And next year, who knows? I've already been told that next year's class will be bigger than this year's class. And it's become unrealistic because if I spend 5 minutes per paper, I'm looking at 13 and a half hours of work. So this one is called Grading Papers. Grading papers. Assignments keep piling up and I keep shoveling. Some have handwriting beautiful as the curve of a swan. And then there are those who mangle every letter. I tell my students, don't write so small it looks like ants walking across the page. And don't write so big each word is a herd of elephants trooping trunk to tail. There are those who space their words so wide, termites have tunneled through every paragraph. At the first of every year, I have to explain the concept of margins and why paragraphs don't slant like buildings falling down in an earthquake. If only they could learn the grace of calligraphy, not the thumbing of electronic type traveling at the speed of light. And when you teach in a middle school, things are never dull. If you get bored, if you have time to get bored, just wait a few minutes and something else will happen. So this is going to be called bus duty. And when you go on bus duty, the administrators are supposed to be out there with their walkie-talkies, and you're just there for backup. But this is what happened to me about last spring. Bus duty. The last bell of the day dismisses 830 students who pour out onto the bus ramp. Today, there's no principal. He's off campus at a meeting. The vice principal, she's sick. Campus security is coaching girls basketball. It's just me, the Lone Ranger and the herd. I need a white horse to ride up and down, patrolling the kids whose tribalistic greetings are to push and shove. The few couples whose hugs turn into slow dancing. A big kid who ought to be playing lineman, but is too slow to make the team, is shaking a curbside tree. How would you like it if that tree shook you like that? The question seems to startle him, like he's the abuser this time, not the victim. And let's go with, sorry. Finally, the line of 22 buses start their engines, and one following another in a well-trained procession lumber out of the parking lot with the promise of home. Some of my main goals when I teach are pretty basic. I want students to learn to love to read, because a lot of them don't read books. And it's amazing how many students will tell you, wow, this is the first book I've ever read, cover to cover, when we're talking, a real novel. We do The Outsiders and The Giver, and the other thing is I love to teach Greek and Roman mythology, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But I get them ready, I coach them all year for the state test. And so this one's called state testing. And when you go for state testing, it's also a test of your ability to handle this group in a computer lab. State testing. After detailed instructions covering how to sign on and the rules of the test, 36 students head to the computer lab. As soon as we enter, Emily can't remember the number of the machine she's been assigned. Trinity doesn't type the password Eagles correctly, so her access is denied. Tristan, with size 14 tennis shoes, mistakenly kicks the cord, blacking out 4 desktops. Kristen enters her school ID instead of the one from the state, which is on the large blue card in her hand. William doesn't capitalize the first letter in the daily code, so the screen says, "Test not found." Stephen, ADHD, twirls around in the old office chair, and Harrison forgot his inhaler back in the room. Meanwhile, students ask me to approve their individual request to start the test, while I write a pass for Bess, who has a nosebleed. This is the Jesus and leper syndrome. Everyone wants to be healed. Now, this is the kind of poem you just can't make up. Some poems are fake and others are real. This next poem is a compilation of the last 30 years. It's much different than any poem I've ever written before. It mainly relies on repetition, alliteration, and internal rhyme. And the 47% in the poem is not Romney's 47%, but represents the working poor, the students who are on free and reduced lunch. And it's a longer poem than I normally write, so I'm going to get a drink here to get through this because my allergies have been kicking in. And usually my voice doesn't sound like this. 7th grade. I teach students who live in mansions and wear the latest fashion, and others who have no running water and a dirt floor. I teach pubescent boys who haven't had a growth spurt and believe they will be the next basketball superstar. I teach the students who want to be invisible and those who demand attention. I teach girls who plan to be models, whose faces are the color of dried paste from bulimia, and boys who think it's cool to be macho, imitating the imitations they see on TV. I teach the girl who is clinically depressed and picks the scabs off her face until they begin to bleed, and the boy who thinks he knows everything, and another who is too embarrassed to read. I teach the 13-year-old who is 5 months pregnant and wears a heavy coat to hide her condition, and the Jewish boy whose father committed suicide, the bullet passing through the top of the father's skull, and then the ceiling, missing him by inches while he was sleeping. I teach the 47% on free and reduced lunch, and the diabetic with the automatic insulin pump, and one who had heart surgery last month. I teach the boy who thinks the janitor's closet is the door to the restroom and tells me it's locked. I teach the vain who refuse to wear their glasses and leave them hidden at home so their parents don't know they can't see what is written on the board. I teach the boy who wears his mother's clothes when no one is at home, and the students with whizzing hormones who walk awkwardly to class, unaccustomed to their sudden lack of coordination and newfound height. I teach the girl who was raped by her babysitter, and like an idiot savant, can draw perfectly any picture placed in front of her, yet ask her to draw from her own imagination, and the page remains blank. I teach a boy who is in remission from cancer, another who needs a liver transplant, and the girl with slurred speech who walks with a limp from a birth defect, but is smarter than most of the class. I teach a boy who was crippled and his 2 brothers killed when their grandfather fell asleep at the wheel, and the girl whose mother is serving 30 years for murdering her father. I teach students who are so nice, I wish they were my sons and daughters. Then there are those who don't shower after physical education. I teach students from South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, China, Pakistan, Ukraine, Sweden, Ireland, Mexico, and Guatemala. I teach a girl who will be on the Olympic soccer team, another who will publish mystery novels, and 2 boys who will star in the NFL. I teach a long river of students which will never end. Whomever shows up, that is who I teach. and despite everything, some of them learn. As I was saying before, I love to teach Greek and Roman mythology, and to think that those stories are thousands of years old. Everyone knows the story of Icarus, but here's something you might not know about him. The poem's called Icarus. I keep forgetting things. I might be the first boy in recorded history to have a learning disability. My father, who built the labyrinth to resemble the pathways of the brain, was disappointed I didn't have his talent. It's not easy being a famous failure. Running off the cliff, I followed Daedalus. We lifted like gulls, Crete falling away below us. The higher a person flies, the colder the air gets. It makes little sense that the beeswax holding the feathers melted. All the storytellers are wrong. I flew so high the wax became brittle, began to flake like old paint. That is when I spiraled into the sea, forever drowning in the imaginations of men. I asked my wife, Carol, who's sitting in the back tonight, what I should read. And she said, oh, read the bus poem. And I said, okay. And so I'm reading this for her tonight. This poem was published in Hubbub a long time ago, so I want to thank the editors Lisa Steinman and Jim Shagru for doing that. And the persona of this poem is an elderly woman. For the title, I used 3 phone books, and I looked up probably more than 50 names of churches, and I invented this title, and it's the Holy Trinity of Light Revival Church Bus. Which I think would make a great title for a book, but it'd be really hard to fit it on a cover. I also wrote the poem from an experience I had from being on a broken down church bus. The Holy Trinity of Light Revival Church Bus. And this takes place before cell phones, but I think you'll figure that out when you hear the poem. This big old ark, the color of heaven, going around a corner, heaves from one side to another. As though a wave catches us from the side, our singing slides up an octave. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. We rumble down a hill and struggle up the next, engine coughing like an asthmatic. Topping the rise, the motor dies, and we coast, everybody silent as in an elevator. Evelyn, the driver, turns around and mutters, "End of the line." We look at each other, then out the windows, wilderness, not a gas station or phone booth in sight. Up ahead, a neon sign, the kind they never turn off, flashes, tavern, tavern, tavern. The Reverend stands up in the posture he uses to give sermons and tells us to remain calm. No one is listening. They are all scared as house pets. If he doesn't ask for volunteers, we could be here until Easter. Judging by the strain on their faces, I answer the unspoken question, I will, the voice in my mouth not sounding like it was me. Stepping off the bus into the blast of afternoon heat, the cicadas clack in the high grass. cards we clothes-pinned to slap against the spokes of our bicycles when I was a girl. When I reach the gravel parking lot, music drifts between the cars. For a moment, I believe my hips swayed to that old rhythm, the tribal beat, trapped in the jungle of my bones. Dancing with that soldier from Granville, these hands, not wrinkled then, fingered the ribs of his back all summer long. In the air-conditioned darkness, my eyes blink to clear yellow circles which float like balloons. I press a quarter into the slot for that electrical hum to ignite in my ear. The man said it would be an hour. I lay $1 on the counter. When my beer comes, I close my eyes and sip it slow. We should have gotten married before the war turned him to dust. I missed that bingo because my number was called and I was fool enough not to be listening to the melody inside. I pop a breath mint, slide off the stool and out the door. The bus sits on the side of the road like a dead slug. Those old women are singing, but the only words I can make out are, "Oh Lord." So that is how I start my prayer to get us home again. Now for a change of pace. The next 2 poems will be about Forest Grove. And one summer, looking out the back windows, this is the scene that I saw. It's called Late July Harvest. And I'll wait for whoever to turn off their cell phone. When it happens in class, I just stare at the student and make them feel uncomfortable. And if it happens again, we're supposed to confiscate the phone, but I don't do that. I'm a nice guy. Yeah, right. However, the students during a movie who use their cell phones by sitting on them and peeking at them between their legs, when I see that, they get noon detention. Late July harvest. Inside a small thicket, surrounded by ripe wheat, a doe and fawn sleep through afternoon heat. A combine, a giant beast, rumbles steadily toward them. The deer stay low, ears folded, eyes closed, against the whirlwind of noise, glinting steel. Not until the sun and moon briefly share the sky do they rise and step cautiously to the edge of the field, fading in the dimming light, the warm breeze pungent with hay and fallen plums from the abandoned orchard. Sometimes I like poems just to paint a picture and have some tension in it. And here's the poem that is on the broadside for tonight, called David Hill Road. And when Carol and I had 2 golden retrievers, we would take them out in this big field for a walk, and further up the hill was this old abandoned car. And I actually got started on this poem because I was reading a William Stafford poem, and he used the word conjurer. And I thought, wow, that's a great word. It kind of surprised me that he used that. And it just triggered a whole lot of other things for me. And I work that way. I'll see a word and it's sort of like bingo, and then my brain puts all these other things together with it. David Hill Road. Whoever owned this '54 Chevy sedan must not have been a mechanic or a conjurer who could raise machinery from the dead. Instead, too cheap to have it towed, the car rests in a traffic of weeds. Seed tufts poke through the grill like steam issuing from an overheated radiator. Plum trees blossoming form clouds of exhaust, while a blackberry vine, a policeman taps at the driver's window. On clear summer nights, under the bright headlight of the moon, crickets hum a well-tuned engine. The Chevrolet appears to be speeding through the soft blue landscape into tomorrow, rushing into the future of its own slow decay. This next poem has gone full circle. I got the idea by seeing a picture of a church in the Oregonian. It was a photo of a painting, and I actually went down to the gallery and I looked at the painting. Couldn't buy the painting because painting was too much. But I thought, I can write a poem about this. And a few decades later, the Oregonian republished the poem in their Sunday edition. It's also going to appear in an anthology coming out of the Midwest called A Ritual to Read Together, Poems in Conversation with William Stafford. Church. This country church with its one room and steeple, boards bleached to bone, endures by the dirt road. For miles around, stalks of ripe wheat bow their heads. Anyone is welcome here. The last minister had the doors unhinged and carted away. Now, white pigeons roost in the belfry. When the Spirit moves, they burst like shot, a choir of wings, afternoon thunder, angels into the blue again. After I got done writing my book, Catching the Limit, I realized that it had poems about the coast and about the Willamette Valley and the Cascades, but there were no poems in it about Eastern Oregon. And so I started writing about Eastern Oregon, which will be in the next book that comes out, the sequel. And my grandfather lived in Pilot Rock for many years, and he was a bookkeeper there at the Kearns Lumber Mill. And he also worked on a cattle ranch out at John Day. Well, back in the 50s, there wasn't any Interstate 5, and there wasn't any interstate going up the Columbia Gorge, and it took a long time to get there. It was an all-day trip from Eugene to Pendleton and Pilot Rock, and we'd start out about probably 6 or 7 in the morning and get there about 9 or 10 at night. So this is called Eastern Oregon. Out here is miles from anywhere. Coyotes, cattle, and sun become your companions. Hills roll and fold, a sea of giant swells, then flatten out, lay calm in bleaching summer heat. When evening unveils its stars, life shrinks under the universe. For centuries, Nez Perce came to trade for Columbia salmon. Then pioneers snaked wagons down the blue mountains. Even today, dust devils coil up and rivers cut deep gorges. Sage grows low so wind can go where it wants, whistling through wire fences. And another poem that was inspired by driving up the Columbia is Arlington, Oregon, 1956. And this was just before the Dalles Dam was built, which covered Celilo Falls. And the poem was published in Windfall, so I want to thank Bill and Michael for doing that. Arlington, Oregon, 1956. The railroad and highway snaked along the river. Up the slope, huge oaks shaded yards on blistering summer afternoons. In the evening, sun dropping below the crest of the gorge, the entire town would fall into shadow, while the far side of the Columbia still baked. Mom said, "This is the last time we will ever see this place. When the dam is finished, everything will be underwater like the castle in your fishbowl." I had visions of salmon swimming down streets and slipping through empty windows. Tugging her sleeve, "Will they move the trees?" "No," she said, and fell silent. The next poem appeared last year in Valparaiso Poetry Review, and while I can call it a new poem, the first drafts of this poem actually happened when I was in graduate school 40 years ago. So never give up on good ideas. I always tell myself if I don't know how to finish a poem, I just don't know enough about life and I need to experience more. When I write, I'm like a painter. I make a lot of revisions. I have poems sitting around in all stages of development. And some poems take me a few months, some take a few years, some longer, like about 12 years, and then this one that holds the record. I don't rush anything. Most of the time, writing a poem for me is like solving a puzzle, and I have to make the pieces and see how they fit. This is called Family Photos, Waitsburg, Washington, 1910. My ancestors came from Switzerland, probably came through Chicago or up the Mississippi and settled just east of St. Louis, and then they migrated out to Washington. And I was lucky enough to know my great-grandfather. In the photo, 8 Belgians have harrowed the field. Let me start again. This is like a bad evening at the symphony. In the photo, 8 Belgians have harrowed the field. Harrowed, I must have left out a word here. This is terrible. Smooth as a calm lake. Great-grandfather, still young, guides the team, riding a gray behind them. In the next one, Wilfred, my grandfather, age 12, who died from a sad marriage long before the valve gave out on his heart, stands on top of a mare's back like an acrobat in the circus. The last picture has faded brown. Near supper time, they are on the front porch of a run-down homesteader's shack, while their 2-story farmhouse is being built next door. Clement and Sadie are both holding cats, while Wilfred sits beside them with his arms around a border collie named Shorty. Even though their faces are not clear, It's easy to tell from their body language that they're happy to be a family, even though they don't know that 2 world wars and the Great Depression will occur, or at 91, Clement will be walking with me, a great-grandson, and he will smile, smelling the freshly plowed earth. The next poem is Highway to the Coast, and it's a poem that was inspired by Ken Kesey's Sometimes a Great Notion. And the highway I'm referring to is between Corvallis and Newport. We drove that many, many times every summer when I was a kid because my parents had a cabin in Newport. Highway to the Coast. Thick and green, the hills rise on each other's shoulders. High ridges disappear in fog, make me wish I was born of water. At the divide, I taste the cool ocean air, the way a deer finds a salt lick, and roller coaster down a narrow road that does not believe in a straight line. Blackberry vines crawl through barbed wire fences. Small towns occur like a whim, as if in a coma they merely survive. I tune in the only station and listen to country western. Static gradually drowns the singer out. Rounding a corner, he pops to the surface for another breath, simply to sink back, still singing. Fir shadows lace the road, bracken cascades embankments. At the next curve, a farmhouse is half finished, boards weathered raw. Chickens roost in a gutted Chevy. Scattered among these hills, families rely on small private lumber mills. The disability or unemployment check, the killing of an out-of-season elk. If there's any fishermen here tonight or fisherwomen, this one's for you. North Umpqua Summer Run. Wading thigh deep, I cast a fly which I tied last winter and let it drift below the riffle. There a steelhead lies, weighing the current, balancing in one place, the mouth slowly working open and closed, while eyes that have never known sleep signal the body to rise, slide steadily forward, shadow flickering over mossy stones. In a smooth flash of motion, deft as a blade, the fish strikes and the surface explodes. Trembling violently in air, amid spray and foam, the steelhead blazes like a mirror-catching sun, falls back, extinguishing the fire, only to lift again, a flame out of water. In a long meteoric arc, cutting a V across the surface, the fish, unable to dislodge the hook, dashes instinctively downstream. Zigzagging back and forth, fighting the current and line, it's only a matter of time until this miracle of energy rests on its side, gills flaring. She's fat with roe, so I work the barb out and let her go on her journey from which there is no escape. Now for a few poems about Odell Lake, and that's in the High Cascades. When I was in college, I would drive up to my grandparents' cabin to escape the summer heat and all the field burning that was happening back in the 70s. And back then, there weren't any phones, TVs, or radio reception during the day. If you wanted to make a phone call, the nearest phone was a few miles across the lake at Cascade Summit General Store. So being there for a week or two with no one to talk to, a person had to make do with what was around them. At the cabin, Odell Lake. Not having talked to anyone in a week, I keep my voice in shape by standing on the swing, knees pumping, arms flexing ropes, making the board go back and forth, higher and higher, until I've got enough momentum and become the metronome. If I'm off key or forget a lyric, there's no one to hear it. On a slight breeze, I sing to my favorite trees, chipmunks scampering the woodpile, the shy rabbit by the lake. I sing through soft filtered light, a couple of Elvis, a bunch of Beatles, followed by some soul and a medley of rock and roll. Firs having stood for hundreds of years absorb my voice. When I stop, not much has changed. The world is a little older, the planet a little further through space. The next poem was published by Elohai Gadugi. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, by the editor Dwayne Ponce here in Portland. On the dock, August evening, using the tension of the surface, voices glide across the bay. I recognize marshmallows, matches, wood. Perhaps the current from Trapper Creek, emptying glacial melt, helps propel each word along. Soon, a breeze ripples the surface, catching slivers of moon like a school of salmon. Gradually, the wind becomes strong enough to sweep every syllable away. Then the lake struggles to speak. Its many tongues lap volcanic sand with a soft, steady rhythm. Crickets repeat their chorus under the cosmos, while high in a fir, an owl questions the night. Heading south, a long freight rumbles past the summit and slowly fades, a thought ebbing away. I can still hear grandfather say, by late summer, troll slow and keep your lines deep. And that's also a good idea when you're writing, to keep your lines deep. This is called The Fisherman. High in a snag, a bald eagle watches me watch him. I drift with the wind, boat floating through clouds, and throw my only kokanee as far as I can. The salmon splashes like a lure flashing sun. After some contemplation, the eagle makes a wide sweeping circle, then descends, kicking talons out in front of him, and snatches the salmon easily as a god pulling a spirit into heaven. Gradually rising, he clutches his prize, and we both row for home, richer than before. The poem's called On the Trail, and there's an old joke that goes when you're hiking in bear country. The only thing you need to do is to take along a friend. Just make sure your friend is a slower runner than you are. On the trail. At any one point, you can only see so far ahead or behind. Whenever you get there is when you arrive. Watch for thunderheads like billowing ships sailing over the divide. Tell time from the way fir shadows fall. Call down canyons. Sing with your echo, a ball that always bounces back. When your retriever tires of being the leader, his wet nose behind your knee nudges you forward. Camping by a small nameless lake, gather pine cones and pitch to kindle a fire. Meteors shoot like sparks across constellations, smoke darting in a stream. Keep clear of bears. Recite the road not taken so they know you're there. Chipmunks make the best friends. If coyotes howl at the moon, join the choir. Pace yourself. Move at a steady beat. Be persistent as Oregon rain. And when I send that out to editors, I always wonder, does that last line kill my chances? I always like to close my readings with the last poem from Catching the Limit. And this winter I found out that some nuns in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, who have had someone praying continuously 24 hours a day since about 1887, they stole this poem. They stole it off another website. And, you know, if you can't trust nuns, who can you trust? But apparently they didn't know you have to ask permission. But it's okay because they put it in their Monday prayer poetry section, and I thought that was pretty darn good. Moving in tonight. After dinner dishes have been washed and put away, I walk down to the dock. Clouds hover against snow-capped peaks. The sun, already below the horizon, turns glaciers pink. Shadows stretch across the hills like blankets being drawn up for the night. Along the distant shore, one last fisherman trolls for kokanee. Below my feet, trout meander between pilings, glide over dappled stones. The moon rises on the water. It is shattered by each wave. With cupped hands, I scoop up a brilliant shard and wash my face with wet light. Soon the wind dies and the moon is again whole. Pale stars, floating lanterns dot the lake. I untie my boat, shove off, and lifting the oars, row across the heavens. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm open to questions if anybody has any.
Well, you're talking about your writing practice, you know, and when you write.
Uh-huh.
I thought I'd ask you, who would you say are poets that have influenced you?
I knew you were going to ask that because I watch your videos on the website, and I've got the answer right here.
Good, you see, well, you already talked about the first question.
Yeah.
But thanks
Sure.
for watching the video.
Yeah. No, I love the videos. I watch them, every month. So some of my early influences way back when I first started writing were William Carlos Williams, Theodore Ruthke. I was a big Anne Sexton fan back then in the 60s, until she passed away. Sylvia Plath, Robert Bly. My grandfather gave me a book by James Tate called The Lost Pilot, which really got me into poetry. But while you talk about more long-term kind of influences, it'd have to be Robert Frost, James Dickey. If you haven't ever read The Hospital Windows, you got to read that poem. Galway Connell, and of course, William Stafford. But having said that, there are just so many people that I read that, you're affected on a daily basis, just like you're affected by the weather. And I read quite a few people that are sitting in this room. And for instance, about 4 or 5 years ago, I thought to myself, I'd really like it if my poetry was more lyrical. And so I've been influenced a lot by Floyd Skloot. I mean, I can read a poem by him and go, wow, that was really good. And then I go back and I analyze it. And I go, he was actually rhyming at the end of every line. And he did it so subtly, I didn't even notice. So, if you haven't read Floyd Skloot, definitely do that too. But yeah, I'm always on the lookout, and I read probably a good 5 poems every day, even with my really hectic schedule. I'll read more in the summer and read whole books, usually in the summer. But yeah, I'm always being influenced.
Yeah.
Yes.
I really enjoyed one poem from the Catching the Limit, Inheritance.
Uh-huh.
Would you mind reading it to all of us?
I would be glad to. I actually skipped over that.
Oh, I just think that's a wonderful one.
It was going to be the second to the last poem, but I felt for time that I should probably forego that. And Pauline actually picked that out in a contest before I ever knew her. And it was a runner-up in the Merrillhurst Poetry Contest. And I was just recuperating from a quadruple bypass when that happened, so that was very happy news for me. Now, this is about my grandfather, George Washington Corn, who was actually born on George Washington's birthday, a great storyteller, and we would sit up late at night swapping stories and having philosophical discussions. Inheritance. In grandfather's shop, I search for a pair of gloves, but none seem to match. Either the right or left has been lost in an act of forgetfulness. I find a few that could be sculptures Rodin would have admired. A hand gripping an invisible hammer, another resting in a lap, one pointing like it knew the correct direction. His daily sweat soaked into the leather, making the palms shiny as calluses. fingers rigid until stretched like skin, worn again. I try them on, and my fingerprints embed on top of his. My hands ready to rake twigs and cones, blown down around the cabin all winter. Thank you for asking for that.
Thank you for writing.
Yeah. When I write a line, if I can rhyme 2 or 3 times in a line, I like to do that. If I can rhyme 3 times in a line, that's like hitting a triple. And if I can rhyme 4 times in a line and still make sense, that's the home run. Doesn't happen that often, and I don't plan it. It just comes out that way. Yes.
Do your students know that you're a poet?
Oh, yes.
Have any of them, do you encourage that among your students?
Oh, I certainly do. And I have them select 3 poems that they're going to read to the class and read biographies to the class. And they can choose me if they want, but if they butcher the poem, I have to show them how it's done. And yes, when I publish a poem or something gets accepted, the very next day I have it on the screen when they come in, and I will read them the poem. So they kind of keep up with me as what I'm doing through the year, and they know I have a website. So a few of them will, go there, and I have some of the parents that go there, and I've been teaching long enough that I have students of students. So yeah, it's pretty well known that I'm the local poet within the school. And students that I don't even have will walk up to me in the hallway and say, "Would you please read this? Tell me what you think." And so I try to give them a helpful tip to guide them on their way.
I was going to ask, that was going to kind of be a follow-on question.
Mm-hmm.
Because of your name and being published, does that help some of them kind of come along and try?
Yeah, I sure hope so. And it shows that it can be done. And I know I had one girl the other day when I was talking about getting a poem published. She said, "Well, do you make any money at that?" And I said, "No, poets don't really make money for their poetry." And she said, "Well, why would you do that?" And I said, "Well, if I have one poem that lasts for the next 1,000 or 2,000 years," I said, "you can't ask much more than that." Some kids get it, some kids don't.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you, Don.
Are there any more questions? If there aren't any more questions, there are books here for sale, and Mark will be here. So there's coffee and tea and cookies. Please help yourself to some coffee and tea and cookies. And thank you all for coming. Let's give Mark here another hand.
Thank you.